Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. The desert air shimmered with heat as Ethan prowled the wreckage-strewn wasteland. Dressed in patchwork armor, a rifle slung over his back, he blended into the ruined landscape like a scavenger bird circling carrion. This planet, scarred by interstellar war, was no place for the living. Yet Ethan knew survival lay in picking the bones of the fallen. His scanner beeped, detecting unusual energy readings ahead. He adjusted his visor and squinted through the haze. A smoldering wreck rested half-buried in the sand. A sleek alien craft unlike anything he'd seen before. Jackpot, he muttered, gripping his rifle. As he approached, Ethan's stomach twisted. The damage to the ship wasn't from the crash. It had been attacked. Burn marks and jagged holes marred its hull. He hesitated at the edge of the wreckage, scanning for movement. The Syndicate often used downed ships as bait. A soft sound broke the silence. A whimper. Ethan tensed, raising his rifle. Carefully, he stepped inside the ship. Smoke hung thick in the air, the acrid smell of burned electronics stinging his nose. The sound came again, louder this time. He rounded a corner and froze. A tall, willowy alien woman slumped against a control panel, her pale skin streaked with blood. One of her arms hung limp, clearly broken, and her other cradled a small child with luminous eyes. The child's gaze locked onto Ethan, wide with fear. The woman stirred, her own violet eyes snapping open. She hissed something in her language and shielded the child with her body. "Easy," Ethan said, lowering his rifle and raising his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her response was unintelligible but filled with desperation. She tried to stand, only to collapse with a cry of pain. Ethan scanned the scene. The ship's interior was unstable, sparking wires and groaning metal threatening to give way at any moment. The woman's wounds were bad. Too bad for her to survive without help. "Damn it," he muttered. Against his better judgment, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and approached. The woman flinched, her child burying its face in her chest. "I'm trying to help," Ethan said slowly, kneeling. He pulled a medkit from his pack and held it up for her to see. "See? Medicine." Her eyes flicked to the kit, then back to him. After a tense moment, she gave a slight nod. Ethan worked quickly, stabilizing her injuries and checking the child for harm. The boy, he assumed it was a boy, seemed unharmed but terrified. "We need to move," Ethan said, though he knew she couldn't understand. The ship groaned ominously, and dust rained from the ceiling. He gestured toward the exit. She hesitated but finally nodded, wincing as he helped her to her feet. She clutched the child tightly, leaning heavily on Ethan as they staggered out into the open air. No sooner had they emerged than Ethan's scanner beeped again. He cursed. A hovercraft appeared on the horizon, kicking up a trail of dust. "Friends of yours?" he asked grimly. The woman's wide-eyed panic was answer enough. Ethan unslung his rifle and cocked it. "Stay behind me." The hovercraft closed the distance quickly, its mounted turret swiveling toward them. Ethan's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. The turret's barrel swiveled, spitting plasma bolts that scorched the sand where Ethan had stood moments before. He rolled to cover behind a jagged piece of debris, his rifle braced against his shoulder. "Stay down," he shouted over his shoulder, though he knew Lyra and the boy couldn't understand him. Lyra crouched low behind a boulder, clutching Kai tightly. Her sharp, violet eyes darted between Ethan and the approaching hovercraft, fear mingling with desperation. Ethan exhaled slowly, lining up his shot. He squeezed the trigger, and his rifle let out a sharp crack. The plasma-tipped bullet slammed into the hovercraft's turret, sparks flying as its barrel twisted. The craft jerked to a halt, the driver clearly reevaluating his approach. Ethan used the momentary pause to dart closer, keeping low as he closed the gap. A hatch on the side of the vehicle hissed open, and 3 figures spilled out. Mercenaries clad in black armor, their movements efficient and deadly. Ethan counted 2 plasma rifles and 1 energy whip, the latter sparking with lethal intent. "Great," Ethan muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. The mercenaries spread out, moving to flank him. He fired off a shot, taking one down before the others returned fire. Plasma bolts zipped past him, forcing him to duck. Behind him, Lyra hissed something in her native tongue. Ethan risked a glance and saw her gesturing urgently at a device she'd pulled from her belt. It resembled a sleek, oblong stone, glowing faintly with blue light. "What is that?" he muttered, but her intent was clear. She pressed the device into Kai's hands, murmuring softly before meeting Ethan's gaze. "Protect," she said, her voice strained but commanding. Ethan didn't have time to argue. He fired another shot, dropping the second mercenary just as the third lunged at him with the energy whip. The weapon crackled through the air, forcing Ethan to dive to the side. The mercenary was fast, but Ethan was faster. He rolled to his feet and swung his rifle like a club, catching the mercenary across the helmet. The alien staggered, and Ethan pressed the advantage, driving the butt of his weapon into its gut. The mercenary crumpled, and Ethan grabbed the whip, deactivating it before tossing it aside. He turned back to the hovercraft, noting the driver had abandoned it and fled. "Coward," Ethan muttered, spitting in the sand. He jogged back to Lyra and Kai, scanning the horizon for more threats. "We're clear for now, but we've got to move." Lyra nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and determination. She stood shakily, still favoring her injured leg, and took Kai's hand. Ethan led them to a nearby ravine, its walls providing some semblance of cover. As they settled into the relative safety of a shaded alcove, he turned his attention back to Lyra. "Let me see that leg," he said, crouching beside her. She tensed but allowed him to examine the wound. "It's not great," he muttered, pulling out his medkit. "But you'll live." Lyra winced as he worked, her gaze flicking to Kai, who sat silently beside her. The boy clutched the glowing device tightly, his luminous eyes fixed on Ethan with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What's the deal with that thing?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the device. Lyra hesitated, then pointed to Kai and said a single word. "Life." Ethan frowned. "Life? What does that mean?" She gestured again, this time miming protection. Ethan got the impression the device was more important than he'd initially realized. Maybe even the reason they were being hunted. "Of course it's complicated," he muttered, leaning back. "Can't just be a simple, help the alien kid situation, can it?" Kai tilted his head, his expression softening. Tentatively, he reached out and placed a small hand on Ethan's arm. Ethan froze. The boy's touch was light, almost hesitant, but it carried an odd warmth that seeped through his armor. Lyra watched intently, her gaze unreadable. "You're welcome," Ethan said softly, patting the boy's hand awkwardly. Kai smiled, just a little, and Ethan felt a strange pang in his chest. The moment was interrupted by a low rumble in the distance. Ethan's stomach tightened. "More of them," he said, standing. He scanned the ravine, calculating their next move. Lyra struggled to her feet, her determination outweighing her injuries. She pulled a small device from her belt, a holographic map that flickered to life. She pointed to a location marked with alien symbols, then looked at Ethan expectantly. "You want me to take you there?" he asked. She nodded, her expression resolute. Ethan sighed. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way." He slung his rifle over his shoulder and looked down at Kai. "Stick close, kid." Kai beamed up at him, clutching the glowing device like a lifeline. As they set off, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed up for more than he'd bargained for. The wind howled through the ravine, carrying with it the distant hum of approaching engines. Ethan quickened his pace, his boots crunching against the gravel. Lyra and Kai struggled to keep up, the boy's small legs scrambling over the uneven terrain as his mother limped beside him. Ethan shot a glance back at the alien woman. She was pale, her injuries sapping her strength, but her determination kept her moving. "We can't outrun them like this," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He paused, scanning the ravine walls for anything resembling a defensive position. His eyes landed on a rocky outcropping ahead. "Up there," he said, pointing. "We can bottleneck them if it comes to that." Lyra hesitated, looking at the steep climb, but nodded. Together, they scrambled up the rocks, Ethan helping Lyra when her leg faltered. They reached the outcropping just as the hum of engines grew louder. Ethan crouched, peering through the scope of his rifle. 2 hovercrafts crested the horizon, their sleek designs glinting in the fading sunlight. Each carried a squad of mercenaries, their weapons glinting ominously. "They're serious about this," Ethan said under his breath. He glanced at Lyra, who was adjusting the glowing device in Kai's hands. She whispered something to the boy, her tone soothing but firm. "What's the plan with that thing?" Ethan asked, jerking his chin toward the device. Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. She gestured vaguely, then pointed to the horizon, as if to say, "It will save us." "Great," Ethan muttered. "Cryptic alien tech. Just what I needed." The hovercrafts drew closer, their turrets swiveling to scan the ravine. Ethan adjusted his rifle, aiming at the lead vehicle. "Stay down," he told Lyra and Kai. The first shot cracked through the air, striking the hovercraft's pilot. The vehicle veered wildly, crashing into the ravine wall in a fiery explosion. The second hovercraft skidded to a halt, its mercenaries dismounting quickly. Ethan cursed under his breath. There were at least 6 of them, heavily armed and moving with military precision. "They're splitting up," he said. "Trying to flank us." Lyra's hands flew to her belt, producing a sleek, metallic sphere. She pressed a button, and the device began to hum softly. She handed it to Ethan, gesturing for him to throw it. "What does it do?" he asked, but Lyra only nodded, urging him forward. "Fine," he muttered, lobbing the device toward the nearest group of mercenaries. The sphere detonated mid-air, releasing a blinding pulse of light. The mercenaries cried out, their movements faltering as the light scrambled their helmet systems. "Not bad," Ethan said, taking the opportunity to fire. 2 mercenaries dropped before the others regrouped, their movements now erratic. Meanwhile, Lyra had pulled Kai close, whispering urgently. The boy clutched the glowing device tighter, his luminous eyes reflecting a growing intensity. Ethan didn't have time to wonder what they were planning. "Keep them safe," he said over his shoulder, firing again as the second group of mercenaries advanced. The firefight was chaos. Plasma bolts zipped through the air, shattering rock and kicking up clouds of dust. Ethan moved with practiced precision, his military training taking over as he darted between cover and returned fire. But he was only one man, and the mercenaries were closing in. A sudden hum filled the air, rising in pitch until it became almost unbearable. Ethan risked a glance back and saw the glowing device in Kai's hands pulsing brightly. The boy's small frame trembled, his eyes squeezed shut as Lyra held him protectively. "What the hell?" Ethan started, but his words were cut off as the device unleashed a shockwave. The energy rippled outward, invisible but devastating. The advancing mercenaries froze mid-step, their weapons dropping as their armor sparked and short-circuited. One by one, they collapsed, unconscious or worse. Ethan stared, his rifle still raised. The dust settled, leaving a surreal silence in its wake. "What just happened?" he asked, turning to Lyra. She met his gaze, her expression equal parts relief and exhaustion. She placed a hand on Kai's shoulder, murmuring something in her language. "That kid just took out an entire squad," Ethan said, his voice tinged with awe. He lowered his rifle and approached cautiously. "Is he okay?" Kai's breathing was shallow, his eyes half-lidded as the glow of the device faded. Lyra cradled him, her own strength clearly waning. Ethan knelt beside them, his gaze shifting between mother and child. "We need to get out of here. That stunt might have bought us time, but it won't stop them from sending more." Lyra nodded, her gratitude evident despite her fatigue. She gestured toward the holographic map still clipped to her belt, indicating the marked destination again. "All right," Ethan said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He picked up Kai, who barely stirred, and offered Lyra a steadying hand. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered, "but I'll get you there. Both of you." As they disappeared deeper into the ravine, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of crimson. The engines of far-off hovercrafts echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder that the chase was far from over. The trek through the ravine stretched into the night, the jagged terrain illuminated by the pale glow of the planet's twin moons. Ethan's legs burned with each step, but he pressed on, keeping an ear out for the distant hum of engines. Lyra followed closely, her gait uneven but steady, while Kai rested limply in Ethan's arms, his breathing shallow but steady. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Ethan glanced at Lyra, who clutched the holographic map in one hand and kept a watchful eye on their surroundings. Despite her injuries, her focus was unyielding, a mix of maternal instinct and sheer willpower driving her forward. They reached a shallow cave nestled into the side of the ravine and paused to rest. Ethan set Kai down gently, pulling his jacket over the boy for warmth. Lyra knelt beside her son, brushing a hand over his forehead. "He's tougher than he looks," Ethan said, settling against the cave wall. "But he needs real rest." Lyra looked at Ethan, her gaze softening. She said something in her language, her tone carrying an air of gratitude. "I'll take that as a thank you," Ethan replied, managing a faint smile. She nodded, then reached for the glowing device still clutched in Kai's hands. As she examined it, her expression grew somber, and she glanced at Ethan with hesitation. "You're not just running from mercenaries, are you?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "This is about more than just you and the kid." Lyra's gaze dropped to the device. She hesitated for a moment, then activated it. A holographic projection sprang to life, displaying alien symbols and shifting images. Ethan leaned closer, frowning at the strange script and diagrams. "Care to translate?" he asked. Lyra pointed to an image of a luminous, seed-like structure suspended in a field of energy. She touched her chest, then gestured to Kai. "That thing?" Ethan guessed, pointing at the seed. "It's tied to you and your son?" Lyra nodded. She pressed a sequence of buttons on the projection, and a new image appeared. A vast alien city in ruins, its spires shattered and its streets burning. Her voice broke as she began to speak, her words unintelligible but filled with emotion. Ethan listened intently, piecing together the story from her tone and gestures. He pointed to the ruined city. "Your home." Lyra nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. She pointed to herself, then mimed a cradling motion, followed by an explosion. "Your mate," Ethan said softly. "He died protecting you and the boy." Lyra's shoulders slumped, and she looked away, her grief palpable. She gestured to the glowing device and mimed placing it into the ground, then made an expansive motion with her hands. "It's some kind of seed?" Ethan guessed. "A way to rebuild?" Lyra nodded vigorously, her eyes pleading. She pointed to Kai and then the device, her meaning clear. Kai was the key to activating whatever the device was meant to do. Ethan leaned back, the weight of the revelation settling over him. "That's why they're after you. The Syndicate doesn't want your people rebuilding." Lyra's expression darkened, and she nodded again. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "So, let me get this straight. Your kid's got something special in him, something that makes this thing work, and if you don't get it to wherever it needs to go, your people are finished." Lyra met his gaze, her determination burning through her exhaustion. Ethan let out a long breath. "Damn. And here I thought I just signed up to fight off a few mercs." Lyra tilted her head, clearly not understanding, but Ethan caught a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "All right," he said, standing and checking his rifle. "If we're doing this, we need a plan. That map of yours. Where's the nearest safe spot?" Lyra activated the holographic map and pointed to a mountainous region marked with alien symbols. The location wasn't far, but it was across open terrain, a death trap if the Syndicate caught up to them. Ethan frowned. "We'll be sitting ducks out there. But if we move at night and stay off the main paths, we might have a chance." Lyra nodded, her expression resolute. Ethan crouched beside Kai, brushing a hand over the boy's forehead. "Kid's tougher than he looks, but he's still just a kid. If we're going to pull this off, we'll need to keep him safe above all else." Lyra placed a hand over Ethan's, her touch surprisingly gentle. She said something soft, her tone filled with gratitude. Yeah, Ethan muttered, pulling his hand back. Don't get all sentimental on me. But as he glanced at Lyra and Kai, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. They weren't just cargo to him anymore. They were something more. Let's get moving, he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. We've got a long way to go. As they stepped out into the night, Ethan tightened his grip on his weapon, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just protecting them anymore. The terrain outside the cave was unforgiving, a barren stretch of rocky plains dotted with twisted, wind-battered shrubs. Ethan led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Lyra followed closely behind, her expression tight with resolve as she kept a protective hand on Kai. The boy's small frame was a fragile presence in her arms, but his fingers still clutched the glowing device, as if it was the last tether to a world he no longer fully understood. Ethan's mind raced. The mercenaries wouldn't give up easily. They had already proven their tenacity and their ruthlessness. If they had tracked them this far, they would stop at nothing to finish the job. Ethan had seen that kind of determination in too many enemies before, and it was never pretty. He glanced back at Lyra. She was weary, her legs still causing her trouble, but she refused to slow down. There was a fire in her eyes, an unspoken promise to her son, to herself, that she wouldn't let anyone stop her. Don't push it too hard, Ethan called back to her. We need you in one piece if we're gonna make it. Lyra shot him a quick look, but her lips barely moved in response. The slight tightening of her jaw was all the answer he needed. He turned his focus back to the path ahead. The mountains Lyra had pointed out on the map were still miles away, and even though the sun had dipped beneath the horizon, the oppressive heat of the day still clung to the air, leaving a heavy weight on them all. Then, a low hum broke the silence, carrying through the barren landscape like a ripple in the air. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and his heart rate quickened. Shit, he muttered. They're already here. He scanned the sky. Nothing yet. No hovercrafts. No signs of the enemy. But that hum, it wasn't natural. It was mechanical. Get down, he barked, pulling Lyra and Kai behind a large boulder. They hit the ground in unison, and Ethan quickly reached for his rifle, flipping the safety off. The sound grew louder, the mechanical hum turning into the unmistakable buzz of a hovering drone. The craft appeared over the ridge, a sleek, black silhouette against the starlit sky. It was one of the Syndicate's surveillance drones, equipped with advanced sensors designed to track heat signatures. A quick glance at the device in Kai's hand confirmed it. The boy's energy pulse was still active. We need to move, Ethan said, his voice urgent. That drone will track us straight to their location. If they've got a ship out here, we're screwed. Lyra nodded, pulling Kai close. She set off toward the rocky cliffs ahead without hesitation, the urgency in her movements matching Ethan's. Stay low, stay quiet, Ethan instructed as he led the way. We're gonna have to make a run for it. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows of the rocks. The drone hovered overhead, its sensors sweeping the area, but it didn't seem to pick up on them immediately. Ethan's mind raced as he calculated their next move. The mountains would provide cover, but they'd have to cross an open stretch of land before they could get there. The drone was fast. Too fast. Any ideas? Ethan asked, glancing at Lyra. She didn't answer, but her eyes met his with an unspoken understanding. She looked at the ground, then back at him, her fingers twitching in the direction of the device in Kai's hands. You think the kid's energy pulse will throw it off? Ethan asked. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. Kai was the key, but the boy was exhausted. The last burst of energy he'd released had taken a toll, and Ethan wasn't sure how much more the child could give. Still, there was no choice. They had to gamble on it. All right, kid, Ethan said quietly, crouching beside Kai. I need you to do something for me, just like before. Can you do it? Kai's glowing eyes fluttered open, and the boy nodded, though his movements were sluggish. The device in his hand pulsed faintly, the soft hum emanating from it a reminder of the power it held. Lyra's voice was low and soothing as she whispered words to him, urging him to focus. Ethan stood up, checking the distance to the mountains. The drone hovered closer now, a faint, flickering light casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Its sensors would pick up their heat signatures if they remained in its line of sight for too long. They had to act fast. "Kid, I need you to make that thing work," Ethan said, urgency creeping into his tone. Kai's small hands tightened around the device. His lips parted as if in concentration. For a moment, nothing happened. Ethan's stomach clenched as he glanced at Lyra. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked on her son. An intense focus etched on her features. Then, suddenly, the energy pulse from the device flared. The drone shuddered in midair, its sensors flickering as its engines sputtered. Ethan's heart leapt. It was working. The kid was doing it. The drone veered off course, its once sleek trajectory faltering as its systems overloaded. The once persistent hum sputtered into a series of garbled beeps, and the drone tilted awkwardly before plummeting to the ground with a crash. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Hell yeah, kid." He patted Kai on the head, a grin pulling at his lips despite the situation. That was some next-level tech. But there was no time to waste. The crash of the drone was likely to alert any nearby mercenaries. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon. The mountains were still far, but now they had a clear shot at getting there. "Let's go," he said, motioning for Lyra and Kai to follow. They began moving again, their pace quickening as the adrenaline kicked in. Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Though, this was far from over. The Syndicate would send more drones, more mercenaries. And the closer they got to their destination, the more danger they'd face. As they neared the foot of the mountain range, a faint rumbling shook the ground beneath their feet. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," he muttered. Lyra's eyes widened, and she grabbed his arm, shaking her head. The ground trembled again, this time stronger. The sound of engines roared from the distance, and Ethan's stomach sank. The mercenaries weren't far behind. The rumbling grew louder, echoing off the cliffs as Ethan, Lyra, and Kai made their way toward the mountains. Each step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath them was warning them of the danger closing in. Ethan's eyes darted to the horizon, where the mercenaries' vehicles, several heavy-duty hovercrafts, began to appear, rising from the ravine they had left behind. Their engines hummed ominously, and Ethan could feel the weight of impending violence bearing down on them. "We're not going to outrun them," Ethan muttered, his mind racing for options. Lyra turned to him, her face pale with exhaustion but still sharp. She looked back at Kai, who had now regained a bit of his strength, his grip on the device firm and unwavering. The boy's glowing eyes flickered with purpose, a silent promise to his mother that he would do his part. Ethan took a deep breath. "We're going to need a plan. And fast." He glanced around, searching for anything that might give them an edge. The mountains were still a mile away, but there was a narrow canyon up ahead, a tight, winding path that could slow down the mercenaries if they pursued. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. "Lyra," Ethan said, lowering his voice, "there's a canyon up ahead. If we can get through it, we might have a shot. But we'll need to hold off the mercs for long enough to get there." Lyra nodded, understanding his unspoken plan. Her eyes flicked to the device in Kai's hands. She touched her son's shoulder, her voice a low murmur. The boy looked up at her, his energy seemingly renewed as he gave a small nod. "We're not letting them take us," Lyra said softly, her voice laced with resolve. Ethan gestured for them to follow. "Let's move." They set off again, their pace quickening as the mercenaries' hovercrafts neared. The canyon would give them cover for a short time, but it was also a death trap if they weren't careful. The mercenaries knew how to handle rough terrain. They would follow them through the canyon, and it would become a deadly game of cat and mouse. Ethan led the way, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning the cliffs for any potential threats. Lyra kept Kai close, her hand on his shoulder, her steps light but swift. The boy seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. His small, glowing hands tightened around the device, the pulse of energy subtly intensifying with every step. "Stay low, stay quiet," Ethan said, his voice low. "We're almost there." As they reached the entrance of the canyon, Ethan could see the distant lights of the hovercrafts approaching. The lead craft was dangerously close, its searchlights cutting through the darkened landscape, scanning for any sign of movement. They had to get inside the canyon and out of sight before they were spotted. Now! Ethan hissed, urging them into the narrow passageway. The walls of the canyon loomed tall on either side, creating a sense of claustrophobic confinement. They pushed forward, moving as swiftly as they could without making a sound. Behind them, the sound of the hovercrafts grew louder. They were getting closer. Ethan glanced back, seeing the first hovercraft round the edge of the ravine. It slowed as it approached the canyon's entrance, its searchlights cutting across the rocky terrain. A second craft followed closely behind, its engines roaring. The mercenaries were closing in on them fast. "We've got to buy more time," Ethan muttered, fingers tightening on his rifle. Without hesitation, he turned to Lyra. "Do you think that thing?" He nodded toward the device in Kai's hands. "Can give us a little edge?" Lyra's eyes flickered to the device, her brow furrowing in thought. She looked at Kai, who was now visibly trembling but still holding the device steady. His face was a mixture of determination and exhaustion, but his resolve was undeniable. "He can do it," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the situation. "But it's risky. It will drain him." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Risky? How risky?" Lyra didn't respond immediately. She knelt beside Kai, her hand resting on his head, and spoke softly to him in her language. Kai's glow flickered once more, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The boy nodded weakly, clutching the device tighter. Ethan didn't like the sound of that. "We don't have a choice," he said, turning to the narrow canyon ahead. "We're making our stand here. We need to slow them down." As the first hovercraft reached the canyon entrance, the searchlights swept across the jagged rocks. Ethan cursed under his breath. They had no more time. "Do it now," he said to Lyra, his voice sharp. "Now!" Lyra gave him a brief nod and whispered something to Kai. The boy closed his eyes, his small body trembling with the strain of concentration. A pulse of energy radiated outward from the device in his hands, the light flickering violently as it expanded. For a moment, the very air seemed to warp, and the ground beneath their feet hummed with a deep, otherworldly power. The first hovercraft jerked violently, its engine sputtering. The mercenaries on board cursed, scrambling to regain control as sparks flew from the ship's systems. The second craft was unaffected, but it slowed down, its sensors glitching as it struggled to track their location. Ethan didn't hesitate. He aimed his rifle and fired, taking out the pilot of the first hovercraft. The vehicle spiraled out of control, crashing into the canyon walls with a deafening explosion. The mercenaries were thrown from the wreckage, their weapons scattered as they scrambled for cover. The second hovercraft fired back, but its shots went wide. Ethan took advantage of the chaos, motioning for Lyra and Kai to move deeper into the canyon. "Go! Now!" he yelled, retreating further into the canyon. They needed to get to the higher ground. Lyra hesitated for a split second, her eyes flicking between Kai and Ethan, before she nodded and took off with the boy. They darted down the canyon's winding path, their movements swift and coordinated. Ethan followed close behind, keeping low and watching for any signs of movement from the mercenaries. The explosion had given them a brief window, but it wouldn't last long. The mercenaries would regroup quickly, and soon they would be surrounded. As they reached a narrow ledge above the canyon floor, Ethan turned to face the mercenaries, his rifle aimed and ready. This was it. They couldn't run anymore. The air was thick with tension as Ethan crouched low, his rifle steady in his hands. Below him, Lyra and Kai huddled behind a jagged outcrop, their bodies pressed into the cool rock as they watched the mercenaries regroup. The explosion from the hovercraft had created a temporary lull, but it wouldn't last long. The mercenaries weren't the type to stay down for long. Ethan's gaze swept across the canyon, searching for any sign of movement. The second hovercraft had landed a short distance away, its engine sputtering. The mercenaries had already begun deploying. 3 figures moved toward the wreckage, dragging weapons from their packs and checking for survivors. The remaining 2 took defensive positions on higher ground, scanning the area for signs of the fugitives. Ethan didn't have much time. The higher ground was the key to gaining an advantage, but it was also the most dangerous. He'd have to take out the sentries first before they could fire on Lyra and Kai. A sharp intake of breath from Kai reminded him of the boy's fragile state. His energy pulse had drained the child, but the device still hummed faintly in his hands. Lyra was whispering softly to him, her voice like a lullaby, trying to calm her son's nerves. Ethan's heart clenched at the sight. They were all in this together now. If they didn't make it out of this, it wouldn't just be his failure, it would be theirs too. Lyra, Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her dark eyes steady. We're going to need a distraction. I'll take out the snipers on the ledge, but I need you to keep them busy long enough for me to make a clean shot. Lyra nodded. Kai can help, she said quietly. He's not completely drained. Ethan's brows furrowed. Are you sure? He can barely stand. I'm sure, Lyra said, her voice firm. He has more power in him than he realizes. And if we can't take these mercenaries down, we won't survive the night. Ethan glanced at Kai, who was still holding the device tightly, his face pale but determined. The boy's energy was faint, flickering like a dying star. But Ethan saw something in the child's eyes. An awareness, a silent understanding that his mother had placed her trust in him. That trust might be the only reason they made it out alive. Ethan nodded, understanding that they were all taking a massive risk. All right, get ready. Lyra positioned herself on the opposite side of the canyon floor, staying low behind a rock formation. She raised her hand, signaling to Ethan that she was ready. Ethan quickly surveyed the mercenaries' positions again. One sniper on the right, another on the left. If they stayed hidden long enough, he could take them both out with his rifle. The moment stretched into an eternity. With a sharp exhale, Ethan moved. He leapt from his hiding spot, running toward a rock formation that would give him a clear shot at the right sniper. The mercenary on that side was too focused on the wreckage to notice him approaching. Ethan closed the distance rapidly, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached a boulder that gave him the perfect angle, he took aim. The sniper's head was exposed. Bam! The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon, and the sniper's head jerked back. His body crumpled, falling off the ledge and disappearing from view. The sound of the shot reverberated off the canyon walls, sharp and brutal. Good shot, Lyra called from her position, her voice steady. Ethan didn't reply. He had no time to feel relief. The second sniper shifted, now aware that their position had been compromised. He swung his rifle around, trying to spot Ethan's location. Ethan immediately moved, ducking behind another formation of rocks. He took a quick glance toward Lyra. She was moving into position, drawing the remaining mercenaries' attention with sharp, precise movements. She was distracting them, but for how long? Ethan didn't wait. He sprang from his cover and aimed quickly. The second sniper was still exposed, too focused on Lyra's movement. Ethan squeezed the trigger. Bam! The sniper went down with a grunt, his rifle tumbling from his hands as he fell forward, lifeless. 2 down. Ethan wasn't waiting for the third shot to be fired. He ducked down and signaled to Lyra. Move! Lyra didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the left, her every movement calculated. She drew the mercenaries' attention as Ethan sprinted to a higher ledge where he could get a clear view of the remaining 3 mercenaries. From above, he had the perfect vantage point. The mercenaries were too distracted by Lyra's movements. Their weapons were trained on her, their attention split. This was their only chance. Ethan took a deep breath and aimed. 3 quick shots. Bam! 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 The remaining mercenaries dropped like ragdolls, each one falling without a sound. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stayed crouched, rifle aimed at their fallen bodies for several long moments, ensuring that there was no movement. It was over. The canyon, once filled with the sound of hovercraft engines and gunfire, was now silent. Ethan exhaled sharply, his breath heavy as he stood up, keeping his rifle at the ready. He turned to look at Lyra and Kai, who were still hidden behind the outcrop, watching him. Lyra gave him a small nod of approval. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression said it all. The boy's faint glow still pulsed in the darkness, a reminder of the power contained within him, a power that could change everything. "Is it over?" Kai asked weakly, his voice thin. "For now," Ethan answered, offering a small smile. He approached them, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Lyra was already helping Kai to his feet, brushing dirt off his clothing. Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride and something else. A bond that had formed in the heat of battle. They had fought together and they had survived. "We'll get you to safety, kid," Ethan said quietly, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We'll make sure your people get their future back." Lyra looked at Ethan with gratitude in her eyes, though the weight of the journey was far from over. But in that moment, as they stood together in the aftermath of the battle, they were no longer just a man, a mother, and a child. They were a family united by a single cause. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.